You know, it's easy enough to look at Starship's new flame trench and water deluge system and recognize that, in general, it's extremely impressive. But I don't think most people fully appreciate the incredibly clever engineering that makes it possible in the first place. Well, I'm gonna fix that. By the time we're finished, you will never look at it the same. This is easily the most powerful and aggressive water deluge system on the planet, made possible by these little guys right here. But it's not as simple as it looks, and today, we're going to learn exactly what makes it so incredibly complex. My name is Zach Golden, and this is another CSI Starbase Deep Dive Investigation. Hey everyone, welcome, and thanks for joining us for part 4 of the Stage 0 2.0 series. If you missed any of the previous episodes, don't even trip, because I intentionally wrote this in a way that would make it so you can still follow along easily. In the first 3 parts, we conducted an ultra deep dive investigation into all of the major issues that SpaceX encountered with the R&D launch mount. And then, using hundreds of incredible renders by Knaggs, we went through the step-by-step process of constructing this incredible system from the ground up. From the trench, to the flame deflector, to the launch mount itself, I'd like to believe I left y'all with enough information to potentially build one of these yourselves. Well, at least everything on the outside. In part 3, with a ton of help from Hansen Space, we spent the entire time reverse engineering the insane technology powering the most advanced water deluge system on the planet. We introduced the methane and oxygen-powered flamethrowers, or gas generators, that I've been referring to as grackles. If you want to know the full backstory on any of that, I recommend going back and watching those episodes after this. Today, now that we know how they work, we're going to dig much deeper, looking at how each of the 3 components of the deluge system operate both individually and as a whole. After that, we will examine the complex dynamics that come into play once you add the world's most powerful rocket to the equation. But before we get into that, there are a few things that I want to mention first. And if you don't feel like listening to this abnormally long intro, feel free to skip this part, and I'll include a progress bar at the bottom so you know where to stop. Now, for everyone else, when you clicked on this video, I'm sure you noticed that it's close to 100 minutes long. And many of you, especially if this is your first time discovering this channel, may be wondering how you could possibly need an hour and a half to explain a water deluge system. The truth is, I don't. I actually needed 3 full hours, and this is only the first half. But to your point, back in February when I first started recording this, it was roughly 80 minutes long. And since then, so many things have happened that either couldn't be left out or ended up changing or improving my own understanding of the system. Initially, I considered just sticking with what I had, but I'm glad I didn't. Especially after the Critical Path documentary from SpaceX, which I thought was going to cover a lot of the same things and give us an inside look at the incredibly complex mechanisms driving the system. Instead, they literally didn't mention the coolest part at all, and minimized it down to 2 sentences.
A flame diverter is like a super simple concept that is like not at all complicated in operation and is just absolutely murderous in the details.
Okay. Yeah. Not gonna lie, I took this pretty personally and was even mildly offended for a second. It sounded more like Justin was describing a simple water tower than the complex system that I'd spent more than a full year trying to understand. But then I realized he's right. The flame diverter itself is a super simple concept, and so is the method of powering it. On a basic level, you're using tiny, yet somehow also massive flamethrowers to instantly vaporize liquid nitrogen, and then using that gas to drive water out of the tanks. In reality, I didn't spend a full year trying to understand that concept. I spent it trying to understand the details that he called murderous. And that's a hell of a way to put it. So while I still think it's strange and borderline criminal that they didn't at least take a second to brag about an extremely cool concept that's never been used elsewhere, I definitely get why they wouldn't bother going into what I think are the more interesting details. Because, as I found out, once you start, it's really hard to find a place to stop. Outside of Raptor development, SpaceX has never run a testing campaign as extensive as this one. And if they had to test it 56 times just to make sure that it was working properly, then it's more than worth the time that we're about to spend to understand it. With that said, unless your attention span happens to fail you in the worst possible way, I promise this will be the most in-depth explanation of Launchpad GSE systems that you're ever going to find on the internet. Another thing I want to point out is that many new details came out well after I reached the point where I thought this episode was finished, shortly before Flight 12. So instead of revising everything, I left all of my original assumptions along with the evidence and decided to just include disclaimers wherever it became necessary. This approach was actually inspired by one of Joe Bernard's videos on the BPS Space Channel, so shout out to him because it saved me a lot of time. Lastly, because of the nature of this topic, where we aren't really given any official information from SpaceX, I had to rely on my own observations to explain all of this. As an oil and gas engineer, I often showed up to job sites in various states and locations with crews or operators that I'd never worked with, where I was completely unfamiliar with the equipment and procedures. So the first thing I would always do is show up early and literally walk the entire site, analyze plumbing paths and equipment, and essentially figure out everything for myself, so that by the time I walked into the operations van, I could take over for my counterpart with minimal instruction. So I'm essentially doing the same thing here, just from a much further distance. And while I believe that most of this is about 90% accurate, that other 10% could be really significant. So I apologize in advance if there are any mistakes. Alright, with that out of the way, let's jump into today's Ultra Deep Dive investigation. This picks up right where the last episode left off, just after we reverse engineered the gas generators and analyzed the initial function and qualification testing that took place out at the McGregor testing facility. 1 month after the apparent qualification testing at McGregor, the Stage 0 team was finally ready to begin commissioning the full-scale system at Starbase. First up were the vertical liquid nitrogen tanks and their pressurization system. As mentioned earlier, these tanks are pre-charged with gaseous nitrogen. As part of the shutdown process, the tanks must be depressurized. Between the two groups of tanks are a pair of vent stacks used to bleed off that pressure. If you ever see those stacks venting, it's usually a sign that testing for the day is complete, although there are a few exceptions. A few weeks later, on August 15th, they conducted the first function test of the gas generators. At this point, they weren't ready to test the water tanks. In fact, they were probably empty. So instead of sending gas into the top of the tanks, they ran the system with the relief valves open. Each group of tanks has its own set of pressure relief valves teed into the high-pressure gas injection manifolds. The flame deflector system and water-cooled deck each have 4 relief valves, while the Apex system only has 3. The fact that these vents point straight up into the air is extremely convenient for observing the behavior of the system. You'll notice that each group uses a mix of valve actuator types on the pressure relief manifolds. Each group includes one gray pneumatic rack and pinion actuator, and either 1 or 2 orange or red pneumatic spring return Scotch yoke actuators. These are basically the same, just made by 2 different manufacturers. There is also another small valve present in each group, but it's not really important for this discussion. These are likely only opened when the tanks are being filled to vent the displaced gas and prevent pressure from building inside of the tanks. And since that displaced gas is probably not something you want venting directly at ground level, potentially containing residual combustion products, nitrogen oxides, or just generally unpleasant tank atmosphere, the vent is raised so it's not dumping that plume into the face of anyone working nearby. Now, focusing on the relief valves that are actually used during operation, I looked closely at these to see if specific actuator types serve different purposes. For example, the rack and pinion units might allow for more precise control. That would enable the system to actively regulate pressure by venting excess gas if the tanks begin to rise above their desired set point, similar to a surge protector. We can actually see this happening in the static fire footage from Massey's, where one tank is bleeding pressure while the other 2 are not. That said, just like the GOX and methane control valves we mentioned earlier, these actuators don't appear to have position feedback hardware, which makes that level of precision control somewhat uncertain. The Scotch yoke actuators are strictly binary, either fully open or fully closed, so they can't provide modulation either. Some may be configured to fail in the open position to protect the system in the event of a loss of comms. While we can't definitively explain why 3 different actuator brands are used, what we do know is that the number of relief valves open determines how quickly the tanks depressurize, and more importantly, how much gas is vented versus routed to the tanks. If all valves start in the open position, then depending on how many gas generators are active and how hard they're running them, most, if not all of that gas can be vented straight to atmosphere instead of building pressure inside of the tanks. And that's exactly what we're seeing during this first round of testing. As far as I can tell, they appear to have been focused on dialing in the startup sequence before attempting to run multiple generators simultaneously. Based purely on visual indicators, In the first test, the spiral nozzles for the cooling system are activated shortly before ignition. When the combustor ignites, it forces residual liquid out of the gas manifold, producing a small plume of nitrogen vapor that quickly transitions into an invisible hot exhaust plume. The grackle then runs for several seconds in idle mode before liquid nitrogen from the primary system is introduced. At that point, a much more pronounced vapor plume appears, marking the transition into full gas generator mode. Compared to this single gas generator test, once all four are running together, the sheer volume of gas becomes dramatically more noticeable. 4 days later, on August 19th, they really began to put the system through its paces during a sequence of tests appearing to involve between 2 and 4 gas generators. About 5 seconds into the test, vapor begins rising from an area near the water tanks. At that time, all of the water tanks were empty, but the 60-inch weir pipe had an uncapped T-fitting that allowed gas to flow through the system without reaching the launch mount. With that context established, even with all of the relief valves open, 4 gas generators running at the same time appears to produce so much nitrogen that a substantial amount of gas still makes its way into the tanks before escaping through the open T. This effectively means that as long as the gas generators are running, there is not enough vent capacity to even begin depressurizing the tanks. This was one of many tests that day, and fortunately Starship Gazer was on site and captured some incredible audio. It's impossible to overstate how lucky we are that he was able to capture this footage, because it allowed us to observe certain operating characteristics that we would otherwise be unaware of. This first test is particularly fascinating because, unless I'm mistaken, you can hear 3 or 4 distinct events that are a lot more difficult to distinguish once the system is dialed in. This was a carefully executed step-by-step function test, activating each subsystem sequentially and allowing health diagnostics before proceeding. Keep in mind that this is a speculative analysis, but I think the first sound that you hear is the torch igniters kicking on, accompanied by a puff of hot gas from one of the vents. This sounds nothing like a Raptor igniter, but you can clearly hear the whistle of a strong pilot flame. Next comes the sound of a valve opening, which might be the moment they begin a pre-ignition high-pressure GN2 purge of the injectors and combustion chamber. This relatively short purge is quickly followed by activation of the high-pressure GOX and methane. Since the igniters are already running, the main burner lights almost instantaneously. What you're hearing here is extremely rare. The raw sound of a grackle running without either of the 2 liquid nitrogen systems active. This is not ideal, and was done purely to make sure the torch is running before proceeding to the next step. Now, I'm going to let you listen to this in its entirety, and you can both see and hear the moment the spiral nozzles are activated, followed a few seconds later by primary LN2 supply as it cycles back and forth between idle and gas generator mode 4 separate times. In the following test, they increased from a single gas generator to 4, and if you have a subwoofer, you can actually hear 4 sequential thumps as the igniters from each grackle are activated one after another. This is pretty awesome because you can also hear the first 2 grackles transition from idle to gas generator mode one after another. Unfortunately, the 3rd and 4th are too difficult to distinguish after that point, thanks to all of the overlapping sequences. The third test is especially interesting because the thumps that I've been interpreting as igniter pops are much louder this time around. I could be wrong, but I think this may be the sound of 4 gas generators starting in staggered pairs instead of one at a time, which would increase the intensity of each pop. This time they do not appear to be spending much time in idle mode, and instead, the burners ignite and then transition into full gas generator mode just a fraction of a second later. If you pay attention to both the sound and the plume, you can see the first pair come online, followed about a second later by the second pair, resulting in an extremely dense exhaust plume. Let's hear that one more time. By the fourth test, the system appears to be fully dialed in, with the timing tightly synchronized. After the initial nitrogen purge, All 4 gas generators activate simultaneously, with the igniters now appearing to trigger at the same moment that the injectors begin delivering gas into the combustion chamber. After a clean ignition, all 4 units appear to begin cycling back and forth between idle and gas generator mode. What we're likely seeing is rapid modulation of the amount of gas being delivered to the liquid nitrogen tanks, which directly controls the rate of LN2 supplied to the generators. This is an awesome demonstration of just how quickly the system can adjust its gas output. With a little bit of manipulation of these incredible simulations from Ryan Hansen Space, it really puts into perspective just how quick the startup sequence is once it's dialed in. When we look at side-by-side comparisons from 6 different tests in this footage from NASA spaceflight, you can see that there is a clear ability for them to control the amount of gas being generated and make instantaneous adjustments to the pressure inside of the water tanks, and by extension, the rate of water being ejected out of the Deluge system. Now, let's pause for a quick interruption here, because when I released the QC version of this episode, I had a few people mention that I should probably find a way to shorten that last section. Ultimately, I chose not to, because all of the observations that we made using that footage are the foundation for everything that we will discuss throughout the rest of this series. It's truly amazing how much information you could pull out of such a short video. I've spent years reconstructing SpaceX's most complex hardware, from flyover photos, ground images, and videos like this, which is a lot of fun when the subject is a rocket. However, it's a lot less fun when the subject is you. Sorry, that's a kind of a dark turn there, but there is an entire industry of companies called data brokers doing exactly what I do, except they're doing it to you. They legally collect your personal information and package it up on people's search sites, your name, your address, your phone number, and even your relatives, and then they sell it to basically anyone with a credit card. As someone who puts himself on the internet for a living, that's not a great feeling, which is exactly why I started using today's sponsor, Delete Me. Several months ago, I actually signed up and ran my own report, partly because I'd been getting a lot of sketchy messages that clearly knew a little too much about me. The kind of targeted scam attempts that really only work when your information is already floating around out there. If I'm being honest, the results of that report weren't just surprising, they were genuinely unsettling. They found my personal information on 40 different people's search sites, and it wasn't just my name, it was my home address and other personal details, just sitting there for anyone to pull up. I'm only telling you this because they've already cleared 829 individual pieces of my personal data off those sites, so I can worry a lot less about one of y'all showing up at my front door. But seriously, Delete Me is a hands-free subscription service that finds your personal info across hundreds of data broker and people's search sites and gets it removed for you. And since these sites tend to repost your information over time, it keeps working in the background all year instead of being a one-time fix. Delete Me has been a leading expert in personally identifiable information removal for over 15 years. And unlike other services, they'll verify your data is actually on a broker's site before firing off a removal request. In your privacy report, they show exactly what they found and where they found it, which honestly gave me some added peace of mind. Now, to be clear, this won't make you invisible online, but removing your data will help protect you from the risks of things like scams, phishing, and doxing. So if you want to clean up your own digital footprint, you can get 20% off Delete Me consumer plans by going to joindeleteme.com/CSI Starbase and using promo code CSI Starbase at checkout. Or just scan the QR code on screen. Again, that's joindeleteme.com/CSI Starbase using code CSI Starbase. You can find a link in the description below. Alright, now that your data is a little safer than SpaceX's, let's get back to it. After a third round of gas generator testing 2 weeks later, they were finally ready to begin isolated testing of the dual flame deflectors and apex splitter manifold. To avoid overwhelming everyone by piling on a ton of information at once, we'll start with the simple visual observations and then work our way into the more complex mechanisms driving this system. On September 13th, they performed brief pulse tests starting with the flame deflector. These were relatively low power, so we couldn't actually see any water spraying out of the trench during the first run. But thanks to the slight offset between the two banks of vents, we know that from this angle, the left bank corresponds to the flame deflectors and the right to the apex manifold. This first test lasted roughly 20 seconds and was extremely low power. The only confirmation that the water was actually flowing was the spray coming out of the weir vent and a rush of air coming out of the trench, which promptly flipped over a nearby tent. About 15 minutes later, they ran a second test, which resulted in the rapid, unscheduled disassembly of yet another tent. This one lasted about 30 seconds and, just like the first, appeared to use a single gas generator. Thanks to the spray pattern and the elevated position of the apex manifold, we were actually able to see this discharge clearly. If not for that, I'm not sure if we would have noticed the first test. 5 days later, they were ready to step it up another notch and ran a longer duration test of the apex system at a much higher output level. Visibility wasn't the greatest during that test, so we'll jump ahead to the following day, less than 16 hours later, when SpaceX was already preparing to run the system again. As far as I can tell, when they're performing isolated system tests, they usually start with the dual deflector ramps for 2 reasons. First, any water left sitting in the bottom of the trench after a deflector test should not really affect the way that the apex manifold operates, since the apex discharge is elevated and aimed out over the trench floor. But if they ran the apex first, that could leave enough water in the bottom of the trench to partially submerge the outlet holes at the end of the deflector ramps. Now, given the power of this system, the deflector would easily overcome that submerged outlet condition. It's barely an inconvenience. But it could absolutely throw off the data if they're trying to characterize the startup behavior of the deflector system by itself. The second reason is recovery. A considerable amount of water escapes the trench during both tests, but the water lost from the deflector system can be offset by the volume retained by the apex test that follows. That means running the deflector first and then the apex manifold gives the sump return system the best chance of recovering enough water to fully replenish the deflector tanks without compromising the isolated deflector test data. Now, in part 3, I mentioned that only the deflector tanks are connected to the sump return, and there's no direct connection to allow the sump pumps to refill the apex storage tanks. After giving that a bit more thought, I realized it actually is possible if you use the deflector tanks as a reservoir for filling the other 2 groups. Once the deflector tanks are filled, the water will overflow into the prime-up line for the other side of the weir and end up resting against the valve until it's opened. But what I didn't consider previously is that the fill line, which is located right next to the prime-up line, will also be flooded at this point up to the valve on the 4-way splitter manifold. So instead of using that excess water to prime up the underground water lines, they can simply open the fill valve for the apex group and allow the water to flow over to the apex weir and fill those tanks instead. But they can't fully top off the apex tanks this way, since the volume that escapes the trench obviously can't be recovered, so the remaining water is replaced the hard way, with an overnight convoy of up to 35 tanker trucks, each carrying about 5,000 gallons. Anyway, back to where we left off, there were 9 isolated tests in total, so I'm not going to go through each of them individually. Important thing is that just like we saw with the gas generators, this extensive testing campaign was probably all about dialing in the startup sequence and defining the operating envelope of each individual Deluge component as well as the system as a whole. They needed to know exactly how long it takes from gas generator startup to the moment water begins to be discharged in the trench. They also needed to synchronize the apex and flame deflector systems so that, despite different plumbing paths, tank volumes, and discharge characteristics, both systems come online at the correct moment. From there, they could begin programming the actual operating parameters, how long each system takes to ramp up to the minimum pressure required before engine ignition, how the gas generators need to adjust in real time to maintain pressure inside of each water manifold, and when, how quickly, and by how much they need to increase output as the booster transitions from ignition into throttle up. But just as importantly, they also needed to teach the system how to recognize when something is operating out of spec, and make sure the safety systems respond correctly. That means validating the communication loop between the water deluge system and simulated booster avionics system, so if an issue is detected during ignition, throttle up, or liftoff, the system can determine whether that condition could damage the pad and what sequence needs to happen next. Depending on when the issue occurs, the correct response could be anything from holding the countdown to venting tank pressure, adjusting water output, shutting down the gas generators, or triggering either a safe or emergency vehicle abort sequence. In other words, they weren't just testing whether the system could move water. They were calibrating when, how fast, and how aggressively each part of the system needs to respond, while making sure that every possible abort scenario is covered. All of that is critical to knowing exactly how the system will behave the first time it's used in anger, which, as we'll see shortly, is apparently easier said than done. To truly map performance, you need to define both the low boundary and the high boundary. And this next test, which occurred 6 days later on September 19th, was almost certainly approaching that upper limit, if not defining it. 20 minutes after the isolated flame deflector test, it was time for the apex system. As soon as the anti-siphoning vents opened on the 48-inch weir, water immediately exploded out of the apex manifold with more force than we have seen at any other time. But that pressure is not delivered all at once. It's introduced in steps. In this footage, you can actually see 3 distinct pressure increases during operation. There are probably 4 total, but the first one happens at a time where it's difficult to spot. Those steps are produced by a coordinated sequence of events inside of the gas generator system. So let's quickly walk through what I think is happening here. As a reminder, long before activation, the underground pipe run is already flooded up to the top of the inlet manifold at the trench wall. Past this point, water would start flowing out of the apex manifold, so everything above that level, including this entire section of the weir pipe, starts out empty. When the system is ready to activate, several things happen almost simultaneously. First, the gas generators turn on in idle mode, likely at the same time the vertical liquid nitrogen tanks are pressurized. If it happens too early, you can overpressure the tanks, so it has to be perfectly coordinated. Thanks to these images taken of the equivalent system at pad 39A, we know that these tanks have a maximum allowable working pressure of just under 50 bar, or 710 psi. That pressurization is of course controlled by a pair of 2x4 valve manifolds that distribute high pressure gas into the top of the liquid nitrogen tanks. We'll go deeper into how this works later because it's actually a little more complicated than it looks. But for now, let's just think of it as 4 discrete liquid nitrogen flow settings, which roughly correspond to 25, 50, 75, and 100% gas generator output. Now, based on the open atmosphere testing we saw earlier, I'm assuming they don't actually wait very long for the burner to stabilize before transitioning from idle mode into gas generator mode. In fact, it probably happens less than a second after grackle ignition. If you wait too long after pressurizing the liquid nitrogen tanks, then once the main LN2 valves are opened, you may end up with a larger than desired surge inside of the gas generator. In other words, you don't want to overwhelm the burner in this relatively low power state by flooding the combustion chamber. At that 25% power level, the gas generators begin dumping a moderate amount of gas into the top of the water tanks. I'm going to cheat here and use some Starship Gazer footage from a much later test to show you this, because you can actually hear the moment the generators turn on and gas begins rushing into the tanks. This causes an immediate chain reaction as the gas starts building up pressure and pushing water out of the tanks and over the weir. At this point, the water is already flowing so quickly that you can see a visible splash out of the weir vents as water rushes over the top and begins filling the empty section between the top of the weir and the starting water level in the underground pipe run. This is a huge volume of water being shoved over the weir, and it's rapidly gaining momentum. So when it slams into the stagnant water column in the underground pipe, it's kind of like being rear-ended at a stoplight, and it immediately kicks the entire column forward. You can actually hear that happen as the water surges through the pipe, begins filling the manifold, slams into the end cap, and violently bursts forward. From here, it takes a while to completely fill the weir because water is being added on one side while also being discharged on the other, just at a slower rate. So after the initial surge, pressure at the apex inlet likely drops into a brief lull until the gas pocket is purged from the weir and the pipe is fully flooded. Once that happens, the system finally starts to feel the restriction created by the discharge manifold. Even though there are thousands of holes in the manifold, their combined open area is probably smaller than the inlet pipe feeding them. At that point, the flow has to squeeze through all of those tiny holes, creating back pressure and likely sending a transient pressure wave traveling backward through hundreds of feet of pipe all the way back to the water tanks. Thanks to the rapidly shrinking gas bubble and the open weir vent, the tanks may not actually see this initial response. I'm not entirely sure. Around that same moment, as resistance builds, the system appears to jump to the next pressure level by opening a second valve on the high-pressure GN2 manifold. I'm assuming that each of these steps is matched by a corresponding increase in output from the grackle combustors to maintain a predetermined thermal expansion ratio in the gas being discharged. With that, the system is now at roughly 50% output, which I believe is the baseline operating pressure. The first increase is difficult to see because it happens near the end of the lull between the initial burst and the moment the flow reaches a steady state. But the steps that come after this are clearly visible. The third step likely corresponds with booster ignition, or maybe just before ignition, to counter the increased resistance created as the stagnation pressure from the Raptor exhaust begins acting on the apex. And I'm sure, as you can probably guess, the final step to maximum output would likely occur around throttle up and liftoff, although I don't think it would be sustained for very long. After reaching maximum power, you can see the system step back down to what appears to be the 75% output setting before shutting down a few seconds later. When we look at 3 sequential isolated apex system tests, we can see the same pressure steps show up in each example. But I don't think these tests were directly simulating a launch sequence or even a static fire. During these runs, the steps are spaced way too far apart, so they may be simply increasing output one step at a time and then holding each level long enough to observe the data before stepping up to the next setting. If this were a real launch sequence, those same steps would likely be compressed into a much shorter time interval. When we look at isolated deflector system tests, we can see similar jumps between different output settings, but they're not nearly as easy to identify as they are with the Apex system. In general, it's tough to see anything truly worth noting. But one observation that is worth highlighting occurred during the first test of the day on September 24th, which was an isolated test of the flame deflector. During this run, the system operated for roughly 48 seconds before the depress valves on the gas injection manifolds were suddenly triggered. Unlike a normal depress where the gas generators are shut off before bleeding off tank pressure, this time the grackles appeared to still be running at high output. My suspicion is that this may have been a simulated fault condition in the Deluge system, such as making sure that the emergency depress will trigger if the internal pressure of the water tanks exceeds a certain pre-programmed limit. That could be done by artificially offsetting pressure readings or intentionally exceeding that max pressure limit. Of course, for all we know, this could have been a real failure as well. But once the depress vents were opened, the gas generators seemed to continue running through the remainder of their pre-programmed sequence before cycling down normally. That was extremely odd, and it makes me wonder if they were testing the vent capacity of the depress manifolds. In other words, what does the bleed-off rate look like if the gas generators are still running at full output? Along with potential pad abort scenarios, we have also seen several tests that appear to simulate last-second aborts, or holds, where the system activates inside of the terminal countdown before the hold is called prior to T-0. This suspected vehicle abort was followed about 5 minutes later by a full test of the system. Now, I should point out that I'm not sure whether their procedures actually allow for a recycle after a last-second abort like this, or if the turnaround could even happen that quickly. An alternate explanation is that this was actually an aggressive prime-up of the underground water lines. If so, this is pretty interesting considering they already have dedicated prime-up valves on either side of the weir, which are intended to do the same thing while the tanks are being filled to capacity. It's possible this slow, gentle process is primarily used between tests to top off a mostly full water line. In cases where the tanks are completely bottomed out and the lines are flush dry, they may not bother with the slow fill method and instead just fire off one of these contained naval depth charges to push a slug of water through the pipes instantly. Anyway, the first 9 Deluge tests were individual activations, alternating back and forth between the apex and the deflector ramp. And that's actually convenient because it gives us a clean way to identify the characteristics of each system before they start running together. The Apex system is probably the easiest to identify. As we've already seen in other clips, when you look at it straight on, it's fairly obvious when the water begins exiting the manifold. From the side, this is the one that looks like it explodes out of the trench. It has some pretty serious reach, and depending on how aggressively they activate it, the water can overshoot the exit of the trench almost immediately. The deflector system is a little harder to isolate because, from some angles, it can look similar to a combined test. And in the initial moments of activation, it appears to be coming from the apex. But thanks to the flared edges of the ramp, you can usually see the water from the 2 wings crossing paths near the middle of the trench. Even this can be difficult to spot at times because the water jets from the pipes in the middle of the ramp are not shooting straight out either. As we discussed previously in regard to the hole patterns, the perforations are drilled on either side of the arc, so the flow comes out at an angle. The result is basically a giant clusterfuck of crisscrossing water paths, which in this case is exactly what you want. Some of the water from the wings actually crests over the flow from the middle pipes, arcs over towards the wall, and in a few tests you can see what looks like swirling airflow near the trench walls. After those individual tests, they began running the apex and deflector systems simultaneously, and by that point, the activation timing was already dialed in well enough that it becomes surprisingly difficult to tell whether you're looking at a full system test or just the apex manifold. Usually the most reliable clue is the weir vents. Viewed from the right angle, you can see both vents spraying water jets into the air at the same time. But when those vents are overlapping or out of view, the next best clue comes after the initial burst from the apex manifold. It takes longer to fill the 132 pipes in the 2 deflector ramps than it does to fill the apex manifold. So for the first few seconds, the apex has its distinct discharge pattern. But once the deflector begins to ramp up, that flow path gets completely disrupted. The streams start colliding with each other, and the apex ends up having significantly less reach than it does during an isolated test. When we compare several combined tests side by side, there does appear to be some variation in how they're running the system. And in some cases, especially this last one, it looks like the pressure may be much higher based on how the water is deflecting over the sloped exit of the trench. But that visual can be misleading, because the apex flow is so heavily influenced by the deflector that increasing apex pressure could create a similar visual effect as decreasing deflector pressure. In either case, the apex stream will end up reaching out further before getting knocked down. So if we're trying to identify how quickly they bang through each step to reach max power during the launch sequence, we really can't do that with these combined tests. The interaction between the apex and the deflector masks the exact pressure changes that we're looking for. But at least we tried. In another test on December 9th, I noticed a random anomaly that has only been repeated one other time. As the system activates, the depress vents for the short stack of vertical liquid nitrogen tanks, which supplies the apex system, opens at the same time as the weir. Anytime this vent opens during a test, it means that for one reason or another, the liquid nitrogen pressure in the tank is building faster than expected, which forces more LN2 out to the gas generators than the current commanded output level actually calls for. There are a lot of speculative reasons why this might happen, but the simplest possibility is that they were trying a different operational approach. Instead of using the 2x4 gas manifold to control the liquid nitrogen flow rate, they simply open all of the valves at once and use the bleed valve to regulate LN2 tank pressure instead. This makes sense from a testing perspective to see if one method provides better overall system performance than the other. But a few seconds after it closes, the vent opens up again and bleeds off pressure for another 5 seconds, which kind of throws off that theory. Once the system reaches maximum output, there's no reason to ever pull it back down until they reach the normal shutdown point.
With that said, this could be a simulated fault condition, or considering that we have only seen this happen on one other occasion, it might be an indication of a legitimate problem with one of the grackles. But we'll circle back to that idea later. In the meantime, I think it's time we take a break from the flame trench and move on to my favorite part of the water deluge system, the water-cooled launch deck.
On November 3rd, SpaceX performed the first cleanout purge of the water-cooled launch deck. This was done using high-pressure nitrogen gas without water to blow out FOD left over from construction. At the time, this led many of us to believe that the big day had arrived, when we would finally see the full system tested in all its glory. But between November and the eventual test, significant work remained on the launch deck, specifically around the hold-down arms and the BQDs, which required scaffolding to remain in place. So it wasn't until 3.5 months later when we finally witnessed the first ever full system test of the most aggressive water deluge system anywhere on planet Earth. But before we look at that, we need to bring this full circle.
Throughout this Stage 0 2.0 series, I've made repeated comparisons to NASA launch pads, systems engineered primarily for acoustic suppression and overpressure mitigation. Those systems are designed to protect rockets from shockwaves, while this system was designed to protect infrastructure from immense thermal energy. So let's take one more look at what a pad optimized for acoustic suppression looks like. And now, with that fresh in your mind, let's look at what a system built entirely around extreme thermal protection and enabling continuous rapid reusability of the world's most powerful rocket looks like. Look, I don't think you need me to tell you that this system is no f***ing joke.
To put this into perspective, this is where Starship Gazer was standing, just over 500 feet away from the launch mount, at the moment when he was nearly drowned by a plague of 3 tiny grackles. It's hard to imagine a situation where they would need to boost this performance even further by adding 2 additional units like they've already reserved space for. If you remember from part 2, we discussed the reducer installed on the water-cooled deck manifold that restricts flow to the southwest side of the launch mount by about 60%. You can see that effect clearly here. The 2 unrestricted sides throw water nearly twice as far as the restricted sides, forcing significantly more flow towards the area that needs it most. And thanks to the orientation of the nozzles, you can see that this was designed to graze the edge of the integration tower. This should provide substantial protection for the Fondag reinforced concrete pad beside the trench, especially during booster and ship recovery operations, in the rare event they end up catching the vehicle off to the side of the launch mount. With that said, given the absurd reach of the pancake system, I can't possibly imagine what that spare 36-inch pipe branching off the deflector system could possibly be used for.
I mean, what more could you possibly need? I'm pretty sure we're good. But who knows? Maybe we'll come up with some additional ideas once we get into integrated vehicle testing. Before we do that, I want to take a second to answer a very important question that I know many of you probably have. What kind of pressure is actually required to produce what we're seeing here? Is this system really outperforming every other water deluge system on the planet? And is all of this complexity actually necessary? Or could SpaceX accomplish the same thing with a giant water tower if they really wanted to? The short answer to this question is yes. The Stage 0 2.0 deluge system is more powerful than anything else out there by a very large margin. As it should be. But if we actually want to put numbers behind that claim, things get a little more difficult unless we have some actual evidence to work with. Luckily, that same September 19th test that we were staring at a few minutes ago happens to contain exactly what we need. This is the only test that SpaceX has performed where the weir vent was left open for most of the sequence. And honestly, I think we should thank them. Because this is another one of those moments where it almost feels like, wait, did you do this for us? Because with that weir vent left open, we finally get a critical piece of information that allows us to make some direct comparisons. As you watch this geyser of water spraying out of the weir vent, you can clearly see 2 out of 3 pressure increases as the system steps its way up to full power. Unfortunately, the vent was closed before the final step, so we weren't able to see that one. But I'm not surprised they didn't let it keep going past that point, because good lord. At 75% power, the vent column climbed more than 400 feet into the air, almost reaching the top of the integration tower. Not only is that absolutely ridiculous, but it's also a critical data point. You see, a vertical water jet is basically a pressure gauge you can see with your eyes. Using the crude rule of thumb that 1 psi equals about 2.3 feet of water head, 400 feet corresponds to roughly 170 psi at the vent outlet. By comparison, Pad 1's typical 150-foot vent corresponds to about 70 psi, and even the Flight 5 outlier at 240 feet is only about 104 psi. To be clear, this isn't an exact measurement of head pressure in the tanks. Nozzle geometry, plumbing losses, air drag, and spray atomization all affect the height of the jet. So the real nozzle pressure needed to reach those heights is almost certainly higher than this back-of-the-envelope math suggests. Now, keep in mind that we didn't even get to see the full power setting, but even using conservative assumptions, this places Pad 2 in an entirely different performance tier. The system appears to be operating at roughly 1.7 to 2.5 times the effective discharge pressure of the original Pad 1 system. If you enjoyed these type of visual comparisons, then here's another one for you. Blue Origin's new Glenn launch pad uses a 353-foot water tower with a capacity of about 1 million gallons. This includes roughly 750,000 gallons in the tank itself and another 250,000 gallons sitting in the piping. That's 2.5 times the tank capacity of the Falcon Heavy water tower at LC-39A. That's actually hard to believe until you see them side by side, and then you realize, oh damn, that is a big-ass water tower. Even more surprising is that this puts New Glenn in the same general range as Starship's 3-tier deluge system. As I've said before, Pad 2 has roughly 800,000 gallons stored across 3 groups of deluge tanks, with an additional 100,000 gallons sitting in the underground pipes when the system is fully primed. So in terms of usable tank volume, Starship has New Glenn beat by about 50,000 gallons. But once you include the water already sitting in the pipes, the two systems are surprisingly comparable. The big difference is flow rate. According to Blue Origin CEO Dave Limp, New Glenn's deluge system expels around 400,000 gallons per minute during launch. My estimate for Pad 2 is roughly double that, but with a giant asterisk. New Glenn has an officially stated number, while Pad 2 is being reverse engineered from estimated tank volumes and observed test durations. Specifically, my 800,000 gallon per minute estimate is based on the volumetric flow rate required to drain each group of tanks in roughly 60 seconds. And for that estimate, I'm only counting the water stored in the tanks, not the water already sitting in the pipes. To be clear, I'll be the first to admit that that makes my estimate less reliable than I would like. But I still think it gets us in the right neighborhood for understanding the overall scale of the system. The longest deluge tests we've seen so far have lasted for 57 seconds. And if that same sequence starts 17 seconds before ignition, the system would still be running long after the vehicle has cleared the pad. In fact, by the time it shut down, Starship would probably be more than 2.5 kilometers downrange. So clearly these commissioning tests are not meant to represent a normal launch profile. Instead, I think SpaceX was pushing much deeper into the usable tank volume to characterize the full operating envelope. High tank levels, low tank levels, pressure decay, resonance, flow stability, and any other weird dynamics that might show up as the tanks approach depletion. At least, that's what I would do if I were designing these tests. But even though they seem to repeatedly bottom out the tanks during testing, that doesn't mean that SpaceX would use the entire storage capacity during every static fire or launch. In the final tiered environmental review for Starship operations at Starbase, SpaceX estimates a maximum deluge usage of roughly 422,000 gallons per operation, even though the total storage capacity of the system is significantly higher. So operational usage should only be a little over half of the total water available. With that said, 800,000 gallons per minute should be understood as an estimated average flow rate during commissioning tests, where I believe they are pushing much closer to the full usable tank volume than they ever would during normal operations. But that average does not tell the whole story. From what we've seen, the system appears to ramp through multiple flow steps, which means the true peak flow rate could be much higher. For example, if the 40-second apex tests are using the same available tank volume as the 57-second tests, the average flow rate would jump from 177,000 gallons per minute to about 265,000 gallons per minute. And if that flow profile has 4 steps, the final 2 steps would be above that average. So if all 3 systems were operating at their maximum output capacity at the same time, I think the theoretical peak could be somewhere closer to 1 to 1.5 million gallons per minute. But again, huge disclaimer, these are not confirmed specifications. We really need SpaceX to publish the actual numbers before treating any of this as fact.
Hey everyone, Zach from the future here. So a few months after recording this, I ended up getting my wish when SpaceX released the Critical Path documentary and finally provided us with an officially stated flow rate.
So for this flame deflector on pad 2, we're sitting somewhere in the neighborhood of about 650,000 gallons per minute.
This is slightly ambiguous because it's almost stated as if that number defines the flow rate of the entire system. But at the same time, specifically mentioning the flame deflector sounds like it's only referring to the ramp. So we have to use our best judgment here. 650,000 gallons per minute is 23,000 gallons more than my estimate for the combined flow rate of the deflector and the apex. So I'm assuming that's what this number refers to. Applying that same error to the launch deck and taking into account another detail that we will cover shortly, the total comes to 925,000 gallons per minute. But once again, I firmly believe this is an average flow rate, and it significantly undersells the system's true capability.
Anyway, flow rate is definitely a valuable metric to compare. But when you compare the pressure of the water being discharged by these 2 systems, that's where things start to become truly unbelievable. A 350-foot gravity-fed water tower only provides about 151 psi of static head pressure. To match the roughly 170 psi we appear to be seeing from pad 2, you would need a water tower about 393 feet tall. But once you account for real-world losses, plus the extra margin needed for future, more powerful versions of Super Heavy, you're basically looking at building a second integration tower whose only job is to spray water.
Look, I'm not going to stand here and pretend to be an expert on water towers, okay? But judging by the amount of pride in Jeff Bezos' eyes when he mentions that New Glenn has the tallest water tower in the world, I'm guessing that building one of these things is not exactly an easy thing to do. With the amount of structural reinforcement required to support something this tall and enable it to withstand the Starship launch pad environment, which just so happens to include the possibility of 200-ton objects falling out of the sky, well, at that point, you might as well just combine them into a single structure and build a massive 800,000-gallon water tank on the roof of the integration tower. But yeah, that would be ridiculous, which explains why SpaceX decided to solve this problem a very different way. Hey, it's me again. Sorry for the back-to-back interruptions, but I felt it was necessary to address the fact that apparently these water towers are a lot more robust than I expected. If they can withstand a full frontal pad explosion from a fully loaded New Glenn, then I'm sure it would be perfectly fine tucked behind the integration tower where it's actually shielded. But that's besides the point. For now, we need to circle back to the gas generator system because the water-cooled deck has a complicated interaction with the apex system that we need to understand. Not only do I have no idea why SpaceX designed it this way, but because they did, it creates a surprisingly complex operational situation. So I'm going to try to explain this the best way I can. Let's call it the handshake.
As a reminder, all 3 deluge systems appear to share a common high-pressure oxygen and methane supply. That supply is probably much higher than what the Grackles actually need. So each gas generator skid likely regulates its own fuel flow down to whatever level is required at that moment. In other words, all 9 grackles can probably be throttled somewhat independently on the combustion side. Liquid nitrogen is different. As far as we can tell, there is no LN2 regulator on each of the individual skids. So instead, LN2 is controlled upstream by the 2x4 valve manifolds mounted between the liquid nitrogen tanks.
I know this is like the 3rd time I've explained this, and unfortunately, it won't be the last. So just bear with me here because this part is really important.
These valve manifolds do not directly throttle the gas generators. They control how much high-pressure gas is fed into the top of the liquid nitrogen tanks, which in turn controls how much LN2 is pushed out to the gas generators. More LN2 flow means more nitrogen gets vaporized, which means more gas gets sent to the water tanks. For the deflector side, that LN2 supply feeds 4 gas generators. On the other side, that same style of LN2 supply is shared between the Apex and water-cooled launch deck systems. Now, the LN2 tanks for the deflector system are physically larger, so it might look like those grackles are consuming a lot more liquid nitrogen. But I don't think that's the right way to interpret it. Those tanks appear to be oversized for storage capacity, not because each deflector gas generator needs more LN2. We can see a similar arrangement at LC39A, where the tank sizes on both sides appear to be identical. So what matters here is not the size of the tanks. What matters is how many pressurization steps are available and how many gas generators that LN2 flow is being divided between. Up to now, we've talked about these manifolds as if they have 4 basic output settings: 25, 50, 75, and 100%. But that's only true if both pre-valves are open at the same time. If you shut one of those pre-valves, it cuts the amount of gas available to the downstream valves roughly in half. So with one pre-valve closed, the same 4 downstream valves would step through something closer to 12.5, 25, 37.5, and 50% of the full supply. So this effectively gives you 8 output settings instead of 4. On the deflector side, you can think of those pressurization steps as roughly corresponding 1-to-1 with gas generator output, because that supply is feeding 4 grackles. But that same valve logic cannot be directly applied to the Apex side. Comparatively speaking, if 2 open valves equals 50% output spread across 4 deflector grackles, then 2 open valves feeding only the 2 Apex grackles would be like giving each Apex unit twice as much available LN2 flow. Anything past that second step would exceed the theoretical maximum liquid nitrogen flow rate that these are designed to handle. And that creates a very important control problem. If the Apex only needs 2 grackles, then running the 2x4 valve manifold at full supply pressure would make each step way too aggressive. Having 2 downstream valves open would already be equivalent to full output compared to the deflector side, which means they would lose a lot of resolution in how finely they can control the system. But thanks to the design of the 2x4 valve manifold, they appear to have a way around that. By closing one of the 2 pre-valves feeding the manifold, they can cut the available pressurization gas in half. That allows the 4 downstream valves to behave like 4 normal flow steps instead of 4 oversized ones. In other words, the Apex can still step through 25, 50, 75, and 100% relative to what it actually needs, even though it only has 2 grackles. But once the water-cooled launch deck comes online, that whole situation changes. Now that same LN2 supply is being split across 5 grackles, 2 for the Apex and 3 for the deck. Not only is there less total LN2 available for each unit, but more importantly, the launch deck has to begin its startup sequence while the Apex system is already running in a stable operating state. This creates a potentially messy situation, but from a hydraulic standpoint, the launch deck does have one major advantage. It's much easier to start than the Apex or deflector systems. Because those systems use weir pipes, they have to purge a gas pocket and build flow through a more complicated hydraulic sequence. Since the perforated surface sits above the water tanks, the supply line can be primed all the way up to the deck plate. So there's no high momentum water column slamming into a stationary one, no giant weir bubble that has to be shoved out, and no ramp pipes or Apex manifold to fill before the system stabilizes and can begin ramping up pressure. From the water side, they can probably bring the deck online very quickly because it's already sitting behind a solid column of water. So the hard part is not the hydraulic startup, it's bringing the 3 additional grackles online without disturbing the Apex system at the worst possible moment. If the Apex were already sitting at 100% output when the deck is activated, then opening the second pre-valve and splitting the same supply across 5 total grackles would actually pull the Apex units down to roughly 80% of their previous available LN2 flow. But based on the footage we've seen from the combined tests, I don't think the Apex is actually running at 100% before liftoff. When the Apex is at full output during isolated testing, it has enough reach to pretty much hit the bottom of the launch mount. And during the combined tests, we do not appear to see that happening. So my guess is that 100% apex output is probably reserved exclusively for static fire testing, which is actually more demanding than launch conditions in terms of the thermal energy management. During a launch, the booster quickly climbs away from the pad, but during a static fire, the plume just sits there, dumping heat into the same surfaces for the entire duration of the test. So for a launch sequence, my guess is that the apex probably tops off closer to the 75% output setting before the launch deck comes online. In that case, it becomes possible to activate the launch deck system without stealing output from the apex, but the timing still has to be handled extremely carefully, because the deck system has to come online fast while sharing the same LN2 supply with a system that is already protecting the flame trench.
There are basically two ways this startup sequence could happen: the conservative way and the insanely aggressive way. Spoiler alert, you can probably guess which version they actually went with. But let's start with the conservative approach. Based on what we've seen during previous gas generator testing, we can kind of piece together what a more cautious startup sequence would probably look like.
The safest way to begin this activation sequence would be to open all of the depress valves on the gas discharge manifold for the launch deck water tanks. As we saw during earlier testing, the igniters are not just tiny spark plugs. They behave more like small jet engines, and when they fire, they can visibly push gas out through the vents. So before those igniters fire, you would probably want the depress valves open so that early gas output does not immediately start building pressure inside of the water tanks. Next, they could open the fourth downstream valve on the 2x4 gas manifold at the same time the deck grackles are activated and begin starting up in idle mode. Opening up that fourth downstream valve would increase the LN2 supply to what would normally be the 100% output setting for the two apex grackles. But in this case, that extra supply is not being used to push the apex harder. Instead, it would be used to satisfy the additional demand created by the three deck grackles running in idle mode. In other words, the small amount of LN2 needed to supply the spiral nozzles on the deck units would be covered by the extra downstream valve, instead of being stolen from the apex while it's already sitting around the 75% output setting. Once the burners are lit and stable, it's now safe to close the depress valves to allow pressure to build in the water tanks, open the second pre-valve to boost the LN2 supply to maximum flow, and then transition the deck units into gas generator mode. All three of those steps would happen simultaneously and would bring the full pressurization supply online right as the three deck grackles begin consuming a much larger amount of liquid nitrogen, while the apex only shifts from roughly 75% to something closer to 80%. In other words, the conservative version gives each deck grackle a chance to wake up before the system throws the full LN2 load at it. And that might be a very important consideration, because if one of those burners fails to stabilize or suffers a flameout during the transition into gas generator mode, there's basically no time to recover. By that point, the other two deck grackles have already entered into gas generator mode, which means the failed unit would be trying to relight or stabilize itself inside of an environment that is very different from the ideal startup conditions.
It may also be dealing with reversed flow, nitrogen dilution of the combustion gases, and whatever other weird internal dynamics show up once the shared discharge manifold is rapidly changing pressure. That is why, on paper, the conservative version makes a lot of sense. And at first glance, the footage from the first combined test almost seems to support that version of the startup sequence. But, as it turns out, apparently, ain't nobody got time for beating around the bush.
So the first thing we see here is the discharge from the double weir vents, which are overlapping from this angle, making it look like a single water jet. After the weir vents close and the deflector and apex systems begin ramping up to their target output settings, we see another vent open up to the left of the first two. The only problem is that when you slow the footage down, this does not look like gas being discharged from the vent. By this point, we've seen these systems fire enough times to know what grackle exhaust actually looks like. And this is not behaving aggressively enough to be gas output from the three deck grackles running in idle mode. Instead, it looks more like a water jet, likely originating from the smallest valve on the depress manifold, which is why it looks very similar to the weir vent. This is interesting because it means that before the test even started, the deck tanks must have been filled high enough for water to rise into the gas injection manifold, flow down through the riser, past the depress vents, and settle in the underground section of the gas generator discharge manifold. So when the startup sequence begins, the small valve already appears to be open. And since we suspect that valve is primarily used to release gas from the tanks as they're filled with water, my guess is that this is probably its standard position when the system is not being operated. Now, looking back at the footage from the test, we can get some additional clues about what is happening if we synchronize it with the audio from Avid Space's Rover 2 camera, which was positioned fairly close to the Deluge farm. At the same time water begins spraying out of that vent, we hear something that should sound familiar if you were paying attention at the beginning of this episode. Looking back at the open vent gas generator testing captured by Starship Gazer, this sounds almost identical to the pre-ignition nitrogen purge from the gas generators. So essentially what we are hearing is the high pressure purge used to flush the injectors and combustion chamber of the 3 gas generators simultaneously. And that purge flow appears to be strong enough to push the trapped water that they may or may not have expected to be there out through the small vent stack. Less than a second after that purge begins, the main depress valves open and additional water spray gets pushed out through the vents. Shortly after that, we can see a few small puffs inside of the mist, which I think may be 3 pairs of igniters lighting in sequential order across the 3 deck grackles. These puffs do not look like idle mode output. They look more like brief ignition events before the system makes the hard transition into gas generator. Without that water spraying out of the vents, we may not have noticed just how fast this transition was happening. Because as soon as the depress valves close, water begins rising out of the launch deck almost immediately. This is a pretty clear indication that SpaceX is not using the slow conservative version. Instead, they're using the just send it version. And in this case, just send it means an extremely aggressive, highly choreographed startup sequence where the main depress valves open, the nitrogen purge begins, the igniters fire, the depress valves close, the 4th downstream valve and the 2nd pre-valve open simultaneously to boost the flow rate of liquid nitrogen out of the vertical storage tanks, and all 3 deck grackles transition almost immediately into gas generator mode. That is absolutely insane. But the point is, this sequence is not just about turning on the launch deck. It's about bringing 3 additional grackles online, jumping the deck straight into its highest output setting, and doing all of that while the apex system continues protecting the flame trench. If they get that wrong on the apex side, they risk disturbing the very system that is arguably doing the most work to protect the trench right before ignition. Now, if that happens, the system should be able to detect it and immediately abort the launch sequence. But if they get it wrong on the launch deck side, the margin for recovery basically disappears. By the time the problem is detected, it may already be too late to do anything about it. Once the booster throttles up and the hold-down clamps are retracted, Starship is fully committed, and there is no abort window left.
After that point, the system either comes online correctly, or the surface of the launch deck gets to experience a few millimeters of stainless steel ablation from a super heavy-sized cutting torch. That is what makes this one of the most aggressive and carefully choreographed startup sequences out of any Deluge system in existence. Alright, now let's take a step back here, because the same clue that helped us figure out the startup sequence also points to a potential plumbing problem. As far as I can tell, this may have been the first real issue that SpaceX encountered with the Deluge system during the commissioning phase.
The reason we can see water spraying from the depress manifold at all is because the launch deck tanks were filled high enough for water to reach important hardware that is probably supposed to stay dry. And that includes more than just the gas injection manifold. On top of the middle water tank, we can see a small standpipe that extends upward and then turns down back towards a control panel. Looking at the other 2 banks of water tanks, you can find a similar standpipe on at least 1 tank in each of the 3 groups. On the bottom of each tank being sampled, there's another pipe connected at the lowest point of the tank, which also runs over to the same control panel. Assuming that there are sensors mounted to those panels, this is likely part of a differential pressure system used to calculate the fill level inside of the water tanks. The line tapping off the bottom of the tank measures the hydrostatic pressure of the water stored inside, while the line extending from the top of the tank measures the vapor pressure above the water line. By comparing these 2 readings, the system can determine how much water is actually in the tank. And if you rapidly sample those values while the tank is draining, you can track tank level over time and calculate how quickly that volume is changing. In other words, those same pressure readings may allow SpaceX to estimate the real-time discharge rate out of the tanks. Instead of measuring every tank individually, they may only need to monitor 1 tank and then multiply that discharge rate by the number of tanks in the group, which of course assumes that you know for a fact that they're all draining evenly. For the most part, this is a very accurate method of measuring volume, and given the condition inside of the tanks during operation, it would work a lot better than the alternative method, which would be an ultrasonic sensor. But the thing to keep in mind is, this only works correctly if the standpipe sampling from the top of the tank is actually measuring vapor pressure. If the water level gets high enough to enter that upper standpipe, then the line is no longer just sensing gas pressure. Now there's a column of water adding hydrostatic pressure to the reading. And because the standpipe turns downward towards the control panel, any water that enters that line could become trapped there. That could distort the pressure reading, delay the response, or make both the fill level and flow rate calculations unreliable. Of course, if SpaceX knew water was reaching that line, they could probably account for it and treat the trapped water column as a less than ideal reference point. But that only works if the water in the line stays liquid, stable, and predictable. We've already seen the gas injection manifolds get frosty after long-duration gas generator tests. So if water gets trapped inside of one of those standpipes, ice formation in a very inconvenient location is not out of the question. If a portion of that trapped water froze and formed an ice plug, they would not only have a distorted pressure reference, they could lose that reference altogether. And since this data is likely being used for control, safety, and flow rate monitoring, that would be less than ideal, especially on the very first integrated test of the system. At that point, you're basically operating in a partially blind state. The same basic concern applies to the gas manifold and the depress valves. If SpaceX did not know water was sitting in that manifold and activated the system without purging it first, or if the purge did not fully clear the manifold before the depress valves closed, water could remain trapped behind those valves. And if that trapped water froze, it could interfere with the valves next time the system needs to depressurize. Now, the obvious solution would just be to stop filling the water tanks for the launch deck earlier, but I don't think they want to do that. The less headspace you leave above the water, the less compressible gas volume the grackles have to pressurize before the system responds. In other words, fully topping off to the point of overfilling these tanks is probably what allows water to start rising through the launch deck almost instantly once the depress valves close and the grackles transition into gas generator mode. So instead of lowering the tank fill level, SpaceX appears to have solved the problem with plumbing. And those changes began appearing almost exactly 1 month after the first full system deluge test. The first change is actually kind of funny, mostly because you could argue they probably should have seen the need for this from the start. The standpipes extending off of the top of each water tank were raised just above the height of the gas injection manifolds. Along with that, they appear to have added an overflow or bypass line to prevent water from backing up into the gas injection manifold. This line is located before the check valve of the launch deck discharge manifold, bridging the inlet manifold for the deck prime-up pumps to the far side of the apex weir. So this essentially bypasses the prime-up pumps and gives excess water a path to the apex weir before the deck tanks back up into the hardware that needs to stay dry. That bypass line allows SpaceX to fully top off the launch deck tanks while still protecting the gas injection hardware and differential pressure measurement system from accidental overfill.
Before we move on, there's one more important detail to cover, and this time we're switching from the gas side to the water side. The launch deck is supplied by the same total water volume as the Apex system, with each getting roughly 177,000 gallons. But unlike the Apex, which uses 2 grackles, the water-cooled deck uses 3. So naturally, many of you may be wondering, if the launch deck has 50% more pressure building capability, does that mean that it runs at 50% higher tank pressure? Would you need some absurd 650-foot water tower just to power this thing conventionally? Well, with this system, there's no way for us to actually measure that, but the answer is almost certainly no. And the reason comes down to what that pressure is fighting against in the first place. Whether a nozzle is on the deflector, the apex, or the launch deck, the water coming out of it has to overcome the same thing: the stagnation pressure of the engine plume pressing down on that surface. If the water can't beat that, then it can't form a protective sheet. And that stagnation pressure depends heavily on the angle of the plume when it strikes the surface. Only the part of the flow moving straight into the surface actually presses on it, so a head-on hit delivers the full force, while a glancing one barely registers. On the launch deck, that angle ranges from about 85 to 90 degrees. Only the strip closest to the edge of the opening sees a full 90, which is exactly why the hole density is so high around that edge. Those areas start taking the plume before the pitch over even begins, as it starts to expand outwards. Then, as the tower avoidance maneuver starts, the engines gimbal away from the tower to lean the vehicle over, shifting the plume onto the tower side corner. Once the target lean angle is reached, the engines straighten back out and end up impinging on the deck at roughly 85 degrees. This is also where the hole pattern on the deck comes in, which is something we couldn't really make out until the Critical Path documentary. The density decreases in a radial pattern on the tower side, forming 5 distinct zones. When we map this onto Lewis Knaggs' model of the launch mount, I think those zones correspond not just to the angle the plume hits at each spot, but also to how far away the vehicle is by the time the core of the plume sweeps over it. Either way, the supply pressure feeding every hole has to be high enough to beat the worst case, which is that 90-degree impingement zone around the edge. Now compare that to the deflector, where the plume hits the ramp at a maximum of about 37 degrees. That works out to only about 36% of the peak pressure the launch deck has to deal with. The apex, on the other hand, kind of sits somewhere in between the deflector and the launch deck. Because of its curved profile, the angle runs from around 37 degrees on the shoulders all the way up to 90 degrees on its flat top. The engines are arranged to keep the core of their plumes off of that top, but since it's still possible for it to experience a near head-on hit,
the peak pressure it has to be built for lands right around the same place as the launch deck. So the pressure behind each individual hole on the launch deck should be roughly the same as on the apex, which means that extra gas generator isn't really there to raise the pressure, it's there to increase the water flow rate. Assuming the holes are the same size on both the apex and the launch deck, we might expect there to be about 50% more holes on the deck. But just looking at it, it's hard to believe it's only 50% more. I'd guess it's closer to 200, and if that's the case, then the holes might actually be smaller than the ones on the apex. Unfortunately, there's simply no way for us to verify that from these aerial images. So the real takeaway is, gas generator capacity isn't about pressure or flow as separate ideas, it's about holding a specific pressure across a specific amount of total openings. More grackles just means you can hold that same pressure while pushing more water through more or smaller holes. And you can see this play out perfectly on the deflector. Because the plume only grazes those ramps at a shallow angle, it needs far less pressure to push the water out. So it's got the easiest job out of the three. That means far less of its gas generation capacity is spent building pressure. Instead, most of it goes straight into volume, driving as much water as possible through the thousands of holes packed across those ramps. And that kind of hints at another key difference between these systems. The apex is only concerned with protecting itself, while the deflector has to protect itself and everything else downstream, the walls and the floor of the trench that all that exhaust has to blast through on its way out. This is why it discharges far more water than the other two systems.
Now, while you soak in all that information, let's get into some real-world testing. Actually, that reminds me. Before we move on to integrated systems testing with the booster, this is the perfect time to bring up a closely related topic now that it's about to become relevant. Throughout this Stage 0 2.0 series, I've said several times that this system is designed primarily for thermal management and rapid reusability, not sound suppression. And for the most part, even after giving it some additional thought, I still think that's true. The main objective is protecting the launchpad infrastructure and minimizing refurbishment between flights. But I think it's important to clarify that I'm not saying that they're totally unconcerned with managing acoustic loads.
Despite the fact that SpaceX previously seemed to downplay sound suppression as a major concern, that argument was mostly based on the fact that Starship is so ridiculously tall that the payload sits more than 400 feet above the pad, and apparently that puts it out of range of some of the more damaging effects. But as it turns out, the acoustic environment affects a lot more than just the payload. And considering that NASA has more than 6 decades of launchpad acoustic data showing that this environment absolutely has to be accounted for, none of this is exactly breaking news. SpaceX definitely knew that acoustic loads were real, and to point out the obvious, this isn't exactly their first rodeo. But simply being aware of a fundamental problem is very different from knowing exactly how it will show up on your specific pad with your specific vehicle, your specific ignition sequence, and your specific ground systems. And in reality, unless a component is directly protected by the Deluge system, it has to be designed to survive those loads anyways. Once the vehicle lifts off of the pad and begins throttling up before it even finishes clearing the tower, no sound suppression system in the world is going to stop those pressure waves from reaching the surrounding launch infrastructure. Unless they manage to secretly install a small planetary shield generator, that acoustic energy is going to end up violently interacting with something that you'd rather it not. Even if you successfully manage the initial violence of startup, the surrounding site still has to survive the full acoustic and pressure environment during liftoff. Over multiple launches, that exposure can reveal damage mechanisms that were not obvious at first. While extreme thermal loads may still be suspect number one, acoustic shock, vibration, and pressure waves are almost certainly an accomplice. One that likely exploits weaknesses caused by thermal damage as it hammers everything within a half-mile radius of the pad. So yeah, they probably do care about it a bit more now than they did in the past. But hypothetically speaking, if they were strictly designing for sound suppression with no consideration for thermal load management, they could end up in a situation similar to the first integrated flight test. Except, instead of digging a huge hole into the ground, they'd risk melting portions of the flame deflector and potentially destroying it in the process. On the flip side, by designing the pad around thermal loads that may be significantly greater than what the current generation of Super Heavy can even produce, SpaceX has likely exceeded the level of acoustic load management needed to address whatever cyclical vibration damage they discovered during the first 11 test flights. In other words, sound suppression doesn't even have to be a primary objective, and you may even be able to remove it from the list altogether, because a system designed to survive this level of thermal punishment is almost certainly going to dampen a huge amount of acoustic energy as well. Thermal load management is the reason this system exists, acoustic suppression is the bonus feature. But we're not out of the woods yet, because that still leaves one major threat the launch pad and vehicle have to deal with. If thermal and acoustic loading are the first two villains in this story, then ignition overpressure completes the triad that makes up the launch pad's axis of evil. And that one deserves special attention, because when it comes to worst case outcomes, ignition overpressure has by far the highest ceiling. Thermal loading destroys hardware only once surface temperatures reach a critical value, and whether and how quickly that happens depends on exposure time and how much heat the Deluge system can absorb. Acoustic loading can beat the launch pad to death over repeated cycles. But unlike the other two, which are heavily dependent on exposure time and frequency, ignition overpressure can break things instantly. And with the version 3 boosters, that threat level has been escalated dramatically. What once had the potential to damage exposed GSE hardware beneath the launch mount could now, if left unmitigated, destroy the vehicle or severely damage the launch pad before the engines even finish their startup sequence. This is not a situation the Deluge system is equipped to handle on its own. So for this one, we're going to need to call in some backup. Luckily, SpaceX already had an effective solution, and it happens to be one of the few features transferred directly from the R&D launch mount. Longtime followers of the Starship program will already be very familiar with this system, but it's worth revisiting here because its role becomes even more important on Stage 0 2.0. Of course, I'm referring to the Detonation Suppression System, or DSS for short. The DSS was first installed after Booster 7's testing anomaly on July 11th of 2022, when methane accumulation beneath the vehicle led to an explosion during spin prime testing. And I said I was never going to show this again, but here we are. The purpose of this system is fairly straightforward. Prevent combustible gas mixtures from building up beneath the vehicle and creating methalox bombs. It does this by pumping a fairly large volume of water out of an upward-facing nozzle angled at roughly 45 degrees. Aimed directly at that nozzle is a high-pressure nitrogen jet, which deflects off the tip. Once the water is introduced, that nitrogen jet aggressively atomizes the stream into a dense mist. The dispersal of that mist helps to turn the nitrogen purge into a much larger plume, spreading through the semi-confined space beneath the launch mount and displacing oxygen in the process. So before ignition even begins, the system is actively trying to remove two sides of the fire triangle: oxygen and proper fuel mixing. To accomplish that, it has to activate roughly 15 seconds before ignition, giving it enough time to create an inert environment beneath the vehicle. Now, even though this may seem like a precautionary system, developed purely in response to the Booster 7 anomaly, I don't think that's the whole story. There is evidence to suggest that they were already planning to install it, but it looks like the system got caught in the middle of a redesign, and unfortunately, reality decided not to wait. Once it was installed, the next 33-engine spin prime test showed a clear difference in how quickly that massive vapor plume was dispersed from beneath the structure. While it is extremely effective when used in this application, I think its purpose extends well beyond that. In fact, there's a chance that making spin primes safer was not necessarily what it was originally intended to do. In my opinion, the primary function of DSS is to reduce the initial shockwave created by ignition overpressure during engine startup. Similar to sound suppression being a bonus feature of the Deluge system, making spin prime tests safer may just be a bonus feature of DSS. While the Booster 7 anomaly may have forced them to belatedly realize that combined spin prime tests could produce that kind of outcome, after hundreds of Raptor hotfire tests at McGregor, it probably didn't exactly take a rocket scientist to predict the additional risks that would be introduced during simultaneous engine startup. If you slow down footage of Raptor ignition, you can see a plume of gaseous methane and oxygen being expelled during the spin prime sequence, followed by a slight delay before main chamber ignition. With the older 13, 15, 5 engine sequence, that meant the first group of 13 engines was dumping a huge volume of startup gas into the confined space beneath the launch mount at roughly the same time. Now, technically, even within their respective groups, this was not a true simultaneous startup. The engines spin start in pairs, with each pair staggered by a few milliseconds. But by the time the first pair reaches main chamber ignition, every engine in that group has already dumped most of its initial startup gas beneath the mount. So when an open flame source finally appears, it causes a rapid deflagration across that gas cloud. And because that explosive event is happening inside of a semi-confined volume beneath the launch mount, the resulting pressure spike has nowhere to harmlessly dissipate. When you combine that with the normal pressure transient from 13 main combustion chambers lighting in rapid succession, you end up with an amplified pressure wave after ignition. That first group was always the most violent part of the startup sequence. Even though the second group was larger, the active exhaust plumes from the first group quickly consumed much of the spin start gas from the next set of engines before it could accumulate and produce an even stronger blast wave. With the detonation suppression system active, the severity of that initial pressure wave was noticeably reduced. You still get an incredible sounding pop during ignition of the first group, but it's fairly tame compared to what it would be if they weren't actively suppressing it. As I said before, with Stage 0 2.0, this system becomes even more important thanks to a major change that SpaceX made to the startup sequence on the version 3 booster. So let's quickly take a look at the latest version of that system. Similar to Pad 1, the detonation suppression system for Pad 2 is a subcomponent of a larger Firex system. This system is supplied by 2 vertical water tanks near the temporary fill station. Just like the Deluge tanks, there are no pumps to supply water to the launch mount. Instead, the tanks are pressurized by high-pressure nitrogen injected into the top of each tank. This is the same general nitrogen supply that charges the bank of high-pressure gas cylinders feeding the LN2 tanks. But because Firex is not moving anywhere near as much water as the main Deluge system, they can afford to tap into a live, continuously pressurized nitrogen line. After the combined outlet of the vertical tanks, the water flows into a 4-way splitter manifold with 4 pairs of double isolation valves. Each branch has 2 valves because these are critical safety systems that cannot afford to fail on command. By placing 2 valves in parallel for each line, they increase the odds that at least one valve will open when that system is activated. Since each outlet appears to be about the same diameter as the inlet, I doubt this manifold is meant to feed all 4 branches at the same time. More likely, these systems operate one at a time depending on where the water is needed. From there, the 4 lines branch into the underground pipe run that we briefly covered when we were talking about the primary Deluge plumbing. After reaching the trench, it enters through the wall and the launch mount at various locations. The first line runs below the fluids deck and into the trench itself before turning upwards towards the bottom of the launch deck. We previously believed this was supplying the DSS system, but thanks to recent footage from SpaceX, we now know it feeds a circular manifold surrounding the opening beneath the booster. This manifold is tucked back several feet behind the edge of the ring wall, allowing it to be protected from the exhaust plume after the vehicle leaves the pad. Looking at it from another angle, we can just barely see one of 10 nozzles pointing up towards the middle of the launch mount. With a booster on the pad, we can see that these essentially end up aiming directly at the 3 center engines. As you can probably guess, this is the fire suppression system for the business end of the booster. I'm assuming these nozzles may have a half-circle orifice, giving them a partial cone spray pattern that lets them hit everything in view. Unfortunately, they can't actually reach the power heads of the engines, so they may just be relying on water deflecting off of the engine nozzles to reach up higher into that area.
Now that I think about it, this is actually way more deserving of the name Booster Bidet than the Pad 1 Deluge system. But we're not going to call it that.
When we see this system in action, there's a circular curtain of water that makes it look like the nozzles are aimed straight down. But you're actually seeing water hitting the opposite side of the ring wall and then raining down into the trench. And since the hold-down arms were open during this testing, if you look closely, you can see individual streams coming off of each one. Realistically, the only time this system would ever be needed is if a major engine rut occurs during a static fire test. Thanks to Super Heavy's engine out capability, which we have seen demonstrated on multiple occasions, the likelihood of enough engines failing during startup to actually abort a launch is extremely low. As much as I hate to say it, it's more likely for Super Heavy to suffer a catastrophic vehicle rut than an engine failure-related abort.
Okay, final countdown. Here we go. What?
Abort. We kicked out early. All teams triage alerts. Prepare for offload.
You gotta be f***ing kidding me. Nah, I'm not changing that part. That's a fluke.
Anyway, leading into the side of the launch mount are 3 additional water lines. We have not fully figured out which lines supply which systems, but we have been able to verify at least one fire suppression system inside of both booster quick disconnect enclosures. Inside of that massive enclosure, there is a U-shaped manifold with several sprinkler nozzles extending down from it. Given the nozzle spacing, this is clearly meant to dump a large amount of water in the event of a fire, probably on the same general scale as the system below the deck. This particular system appears to be triggered by flame detection sensors mounted on the wall. I suspect one of these lines feeds a fire suppression system for the fluids deck and the methane QD, while the other covers the entire mechanical deck and then loops up through the LOX QD. This is just an educated guess, of course, and it's kind of irrelevant for this investigation. What matters here is that at least one of these 4 lines must be supplying the DSS system, so by process of elimination, we're going to assume it's this one. It took a while to pinpoint where these nozzles were located, because for several months, the only thing we had to work from was this grainy image posted by Kiko Donchev when the launch mount for Pad 39A was installed. We could see what appeared to be a U-shaped pipe mounted to the underside of the mechanical deck a few feet from the corner, but there wasn't enough detail to confirm it was part of the DSS system. Thanks to the documentary footage, we can now clearly see the nozzle assemblies hanging down in each corner. And this reveals one of the biggest differences between the two systems. The original DSS had 6 nozzles spraying towards the center, but the new system uses 4 corner assemblies, each splitting into 2 upward-facing water nozzles. Those paired nozzles are angled away from each other, creating an overlapping spray pattern that forms a rough octagon around the center engines. Similar to the original system, each nozzle has a nitrogen jet aimed directly at the water stream, using a virtually identical bracket design from Pad 1. That nitrogen is supplied from the bunker through a dedicated line entering the lower level of the launch deck. I haven't been able to figure out which one it is, but that doesn't really matter. Given how small these nozzles are, it's easy to underestimate the power behind this system. But once you see it in action, you can tell it does an extremely good job of displacing air under the launch mount, and it appears to be a major step up from the original. That's not necessarily a result of increased water or nitrogen flow, since there's really no way for us to compare that or put meaningful numbers behind it. Instead, I think it's the design of the launch structure itself that's providing a noticeable enhancement in performance. With the original version, the spray pattern was heavily affected by the wind, which tended to carry a lot of it away before it could reach the blast surface, leaving an oxygenated pocket underneath. Thanks to the trench walls providing some containment, it now does a much better job filling the volume beneath the structure. In fact, at times you can barely even see through it. Building upon what they learned with the R&D launch mount, and making the system as effective as possible was absolutely critical. Because even though DSS is only a small part of the overall pad protection system, it's the only defensive measure specifically protecting the vehicle from its own ignition sequence.
So anytime you see this system activated, just know that it's quietly managing the part of the countdown where things can go wrong the fastest. With that out of the way, let's take a break from this onslaught of information and finally get into some integrated vehicle testing for real this time, shall we?
On March 10th of 2026, with 10 engines installed in a balanced but seemingly random arrangement on Booster 19, it was finally time to begin the engine testing campaign. It's important to remember that, unlike the normal pre-flight test campaigns that we're used to seeing, this was as much of a test of the launch infrastructure as it was of the vehicle. There's only so much you can learn from testing brand new pad systems without a real booster sitting on the mount. Everything up to this point was function testing, but this was the commissioning phase, and you really can't do that without a booster. So in that sense, B19 was essentially being used the same way that Booster 4 was. Except this time around, a lot more caution was taken to make sure that the vehicle would remain flight-worthy afterward. After topping off the LOX tank and loading a small amount of methane, they were ready for the first spin prime test of Booster 19. Allegedly. Unfortunately, DSS was so aggressive during this test that we couldn't see much of anything happening beneath the booster. But even with the view almost completely obscured, we can still make an important observation, which is the fact that the Deluge system was activated alongside the DSS, including both the flame deflector and the apex system. There are 2 possible explanations for this. The simplest answer is that they were trying to execute as much of the real launch sequence as possible, with basically every step except for pre-burner and main chamber ignition enabled. The second is that the Deluge system was actively helping DSS neutralize the combustible environment beneath the booster. And that would make a lot of sense. During a spin prime test, you're still dumping a dangerous cocktail of methane and oxygen into the volume beneath the vehicle. With DSS creating a vortex around the circular opening beneath the engines, and because that volume is mostly enclosed by the launch mount geometry, the expelled vapor cloud has nowhere else to go but down. That drives the mixture directly into the fast-moving water being ejected by the apex system. From there, some of the gas may dissolve into the water, but the bigger effect is likely dilution, entrainment, and physical removal as the water flow carries that mixture out of the trench. So DSS is not doing this job alone. The Deluge system is helping capture, dilute, and evacuate the combustible gas mixture before it has a chance to linger beneath the vehicle. That partnership dramatically improves the effectiveness of DSS and minimizes the risk associated with these inherently dangerous spin prime tests.
Next up was the igniter test 5 days later. This was probably one of the bigger surprises for those of us who follow this stuff closer than feels legally permissible.
On the previous versions of the ship and booster, igniter tests could be performed at any time of day with no road closure. They used methane and oxygen stored in COPVs on the vehicle, or supplied by the Raptor QDs, and when they tested the igniters, that's all it was, an igniter test. So when SpaceX started loading the same amount of propellant onto Booster 19 that we'd expect for a small static fire, most of us assumed that's what we were about to see. But nope. As it turned out, instead of testing the igniters by themselves, they now appear to test them alongside the spin prime. By remixing footage from the Raptor 3 full-duration ascent burn, we can put together a rough visual representation of what this igniter test actually looked like behind all that mist. This new ignition system sounds pretty intense, and what's even crazier is that this isn't even its final form. This is where the new startup sequence I mentioned a few minutes ago starts to become much more important. When SpaceX rolled out the first upgraded methane transfer tube for Booster 18, one of the first details they revealed about the V3 booster was that the propulsion system was designed to enable simultaneous startup of all 33 engines.
Honestly, I remember thinking that was absolutely insane when they first announced it, because that is not a feature that you just casually enable in software.
Up to this point, super heavy ignition had always been staggered across multiple groups. V3 compresses that entire process into a single startup event. The engines may still be staggered within that group, but when viewed at real-time speed, it's virtually imperceptible. That is an absolutely massive change, and in my opinion, it's also an inherently dangerous one. To put that into perspective, the old initial startup group using 13 Raptor 2s was already in the same class as lighting both SLS solid rocket boosters at once. Now, to be clear, thrust is not the same thing as ignition overpressure. SRBs and Methalox engines have completely different startup behavior. But as a rough sense of scale, it gives you an idea of what SpaceX was already dealing with before. With version 3, if all 33 Raptor 3s come alive at the same moment, you're now talking about the thrust equivalent of nearly 6 SLS SRBs lighting under the vehicle at once.
Simultaneous 33-engine startup is already an insane feat in fluid dynamics, which has the potential to completely destroy the vehicle almost instantly. And making it survivable comes with a terrifying amount of engineering baggage.
The vehicle has to feed every engine at the same time, each Raptor has to survive its own startup transient, the booster has to coordinate the combined ignition sequence, and the pad has to survive the pressure pulse while also protecting the vehicle from it. With that said, I suspect the new Raptor 3 ignition behavior may be specifically intended to make simultaneous startup less aggressive than it otherwise has the potential to be. As part of that sequence, all of the propellant being expelled during spin start is no longer sitting beneath the booster as one large unburned vapor cloud. Instead, the igniters appear to burn away the excess gas in what is basically a controlled pre-ignition event. But controlled does not mean harmless. That still creates its own pressure pulse before main chamber ignition, which means the Deluge system still has a very important job to do. The goal is to remove as much explosive potential as possible before the main ignition source gets involved so you don't end up with an actual detonation. So if ignition overpressure was already important before, then version 3 definitely takes that to another level. At that point, you need every available mechanism you can come up with to help manage the environment beneath the vehicle before the engines light. DSS is the most obvious part of this strategy, but during the first static fire test, we learned about another major piece of the plan. This was something we couldn't determine until the vehicle was actually on the pad. How long before ignition would SpaceX activate the Deluge system? On the R&D launch mount, DSS activated around T-15 seconds, followed by the booster bidet at T-6 seconds, giving the water system just enough time to ramp up to the required pressure before ignition. So during the 10-engine static fire test on March 16th, this was the number one thing I was looking for. And as it turns out, the pre-ignition Deluge activation time is nearly twice as long. In fact, it was so long that if you were watching live, you probably thought the test had been aborted. At just over 10 seconds, this might seem like overkill, or maybe even a waste of water. Based on the estimated combined flow rate of 627,000 gallons per minute between the apex and deflector systems, that means roughly 105,000 gallons were discharged before the engines were even lit. But is that really wasted? Surely it doesn't take 10 seconds to reach full power and verify the system is operating as expected, right? Well, as I'm sure you noticed, a good portion of that water does end up overflowing out of the trench. But not all of it. And one somewhat obvious yet major advantage that a subsurface trench has over an above-grade flame duct is that it can be flooded before ignition, creating a large body of water at the base of the ramp. When it comes to dampening ignition overpressure and suppressing acoustic shockwaves, that approach can be extremely effective. If you happen to watch and were actually paying attention to this specific detail during Blue Origin's NG2 or NG3 launch broadcasts, then you probably saw this in action. Hours or possibly even days in advance of the launch, judging by the green coloration, the subsurface flame trench is almost completely filled with water. As I mentioned before, this water tower has a capacity of about 700,000 gallons, and when you include the water already sitting in the pipes, the total system capacity is probably closer to 1 million gallons. While this is somewhat speculative, I suspect that more than half of that capacity, somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 gallons, is released into the trench ahead of time before the water tower is fully topped off again. That might sound like an absurd estimate, but according to Blue Origin's water permit from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, each launch of New Glenn is legally approved to use up to 1 million gallons of water, so the estimate is not unreasonable. If the system could dump that entire volume through the Deluge hardware during the launch sequence, there would probably be no need to pre-fill the trench. But with a maximum flow rate of around 400,000 gallons per minute, a 30-second activation only accounts for roughly 200,000 gallons. So my guess is that whatever portion of the permitted 1 million gallons that cannot be delivered during the short activation window is instead released into the trench ahead of time. That would make New Glenn's Deluge system the largest on the planet by total water volume, although it's only the second most powerful in terms of operating pressure and third when it comes to maximum flow rate. Somewhere around T-30 seconds, the Deluge system on the flame diverter is activated and begins filling the trench even more. If I had to guess, there's probably more than 15 feet of water at its deepest point. By the time the rainbirds are activated, the trench is completely filled to the point of overflowing. When the engines are finally ignited, the initial overpressure is like doing a cannonball into a pool. You can actually see the water splashing out through the gaps on the side of the launch structure. After this, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water are lifted and pushed out of the trench by the hot exhaust gases. The effect this has on acoustic dampening is incredible. After the initial startup, the sound produced by the engines is heavily muffled and there are no visible shockwaves. Now, let's compare that to the sound of Super Heavy, starting with a raw ignition with no Deluge system present, just so we can establish a baseline. Oh, by the way, here's your 5-second courtesy warning in case you need to turn the volume down, because as you can probably guess, the difference is immense. Good lord. Kinda missed those days. Now, let's see how this changes with the Deluge system active. As you can hear, it's definitely got a bit of an acoustic dampening quality, but for the most part, it's still extremely loud. Furthermore, you can clearly see the apocalyptic shockwaves that would probably make the chief financial officer of any other launch provider on the planet have to discreetly leave the room and acquire a change of pants if they saw this happening anywhere near their delicate and expensive payloads. So, given that both of these vehicles are using water Deluge systems with similar flow rates, yet one is vastly more effective at managing the acoustic environment, the biggest difference maker is pretty obvious. New Glenn is firing into a trench that is already flooded, and the results clearly speak for themselves. So if you went through the trouble of building a massive subsurface flame trench, it would be kind of crazy not to take advantage of that ridiculously simple cheat code.
Thankfully, based on what we've seen so far from Pad 2 testing, Starship may have finally decided to choose a slightly less violent path in life, at least acoustically. But it's not doing that the same way Blue Origin does. If New Glenn's water usage were scaled proportionally by thrust for a version 3 Super Heavy launch, SpaceX would need something like 4.5 million gallons of water for every flight. That's equivalent to roughly 10% of Brownsville's entire daily municipal water treatment capacity. So I seriously doubt anyone would ever approve that as a normal launch requirement. Fortunately, SpaceX did themselves a huge favor on the regulatory side by solving the same problem from the opposite direction. New Glenn appears to rely on a massive pre-fill volume to compensate for a lower delivery rate during the actual launch sequence. Starship, on the other hand, can get away with a much smaller pre-fill volume because the Deluge system is built to deliver a ridiculous amount of water on demand, right when and where it's needed. With Stage 0 2.0, activating the Deluge system roughly 10 seconds before ignition could leave somewhere around 80,000 to 120,000 gallons of water sitting in the trench by the time the engines light. That is nowhere near the pre-fill volume Blue Origin is using with New Glenn, but with roughly an eighth of an Olympic swimming pool sitting beneath the booster, it should still make the vastly more powerful version 3 vehicle sound far quieter than what we're used to. Well, at least up until the moment that Super Heavy finishes yeeting most of that water up out of the trench. With that said, let's pick up where we left off on the day of the 10-engine static fire test. Alright everyone, I'm really sorry because I know this is a very awkward stopping point. As I mentioned during the intro, this episode is 3 hours long in total, but I found that if I release episodes over a certain length, which this one actually violates, most people literally won't watch them.
You can kind of see that here in this comparison between parts 2 and 3. Unfortunately, that creates a problem. Because this was written as a single episode, I didn't really plan a clean breakpoint in advance that actually makes sense like I did with the others. So I basically had to just split it right down the middle. With that said, we'll pick up right where we left off in what I hope is the final installment of the Stage 0 2.0 series. This has been extremely exhausting. In that episode, we'll cover everything from the beginning of the static fire testing campaign up to and including Flight 13. This is also when we'll address the cause behind the 2 aborted static fires, along with the lesser-known issues that SpaceX came across during the extensive testing campaign, and we'll examine how those problems were solved. That was perhaps the most challenging part of this entire series for me to explain in a way that's easy to follow, but I think we did a pretty good job of it. The good news is that it's already fully recorded, and if you're a Patreon supporter or a member of the channel, you should have access to the QC version of Part 5 before the end of the weekend. If you're not a member but still want to support the channel, please consider donating via PayPal using the link in the description. As I've done the past few times, I'll send you a link to the ad-free members version once it's released. As much as I hate to ask, with the amount of time and effort that has gone into producing a series that's just 90 minutes short of matching the Lord of the Rings trilogy, every level of support goes a long way. And not just for me, but for Knaggs, Ryan Hansen Space, and my producer and editor Geoff, who the series wouldn't have been possible without. Right now, I'm expecting the official release to be 1 week from today, but I can't make any promises. I've been seriously neglecting my car since January in order to focus on this, and sadly, it's finally caught up to me. Hopefully that won't turn into a bigger maintenance problem than I think it will be. Anyway, as I've said, I appreciate everyone who's helped to make this possible. That includes everyone whose content was used in this deep dive investigation. You can find links to all of their various platforms in the description. Last but not least, thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring today's episode. I hope to see you all on the next one. For now, this is Stage 0 Zach, signing off.